end of the day, so we decided what you needed was a good old-fashioned bun fight, also known as an Oxford-style debate. We're going to have quite strict rules around a motion which we're going to debate, which is, has globalization gone too far? I suspect we're going to have the normal kind of debate about the question and the real meaning of, but let's just take what we think of as being the meaning of, has globalization gone too far? We've got 4 speakers, 2 on each side. They're each going to have no more than 5 minutes, and I'm going to be extremely strict. I have my virtual shepherd's crook, where I would take them off after 5 minutes. Then we'll have a little back and forth, and then a final vote to see if any minds have been changed. But of course, we have to start by seeing the lay of the room. So can I ask for a show of hands now, those people who support the motion, yes, globalization has gone too far? You could say this is a really hopeless venue to talk about globalization going too far, but anyway. Okay, so we have, actually this is going to be very tough for the other side, because it's presumably, I hope, not going to be that hard to persuade just a few more people to support the motion. So first up, we have, and I say I'm going to be very strict about this, but we have to oppose the motion, to say that globalization has not gone too far. I'm very pleased to introduce Parag Khanna, who is the managing partner of FutureMap. Parag.
It is not enough that we merely defeat this motion. We must destroy its very premise. And I'll begin by pointing out its sheer futility. Globalization is not merely a project. Globalization is a deep historical process. It began 100,000 years ago as our ancestors began wandering across the continents and has expanded in lockstep with all of the infrastructures of transportation, energy, and communications that we have built to connect all the continents, cities, and peoples of the world. There have been blips along the way, like the plague or World War I. During the financial crisis, some vectors slowed down and even reversed, like interbank lending. But if you look at the overall expansion of the flows of people, goods, capital, and data, you could only conclude that globalization is just getting warmed up. And look ahead. China opens its debt markets next year. Trillions of dollars are going to flow into emerging markets again as they privatize sectors and list equities that then get included in market indices. From our financial markets to our supply chains to our digital communities, globalization is becoming more global every single day. If your portfolio manager doesn't believe in globalization, fire him or fire your president. Far too often, we talk about globalization as if it depends on a fixed set of liberal market rules. But it's silly to conflate globalization and free markets. You don't get to freeze the present and pretend that your version of globalization is the end of history. The Dutch and British East India companies use mercantilist policies to extract resources from colonies and expand their role in global trade. America used import substitution to get ahead of the British. Ever heard of Alexander Hamilton or seen the play? And China has followed the same playbook, plus industrial policy, to boost globalization with Chinese characteristics. Xi Jinping's famous Davos speech from 2 years ago was a defense of globalization, not of free trade. And the vast majority of Asians, which is the vast majority of the world population, supports globalization precisely because their governments are actively steering it and managing it for their benefit. To be clear, the reason globalization continues to expand is not because it's a level playing field, but it's because everyone benefits to some degree, and they have interests that benefit from it. It is a web with many spiders. In fact, the web of globalization has never had more spiders than today, weaving vast and thick webs. Now let's turn to whether we should scale back globalization. Who says that? Is it those oracles of utilitarian economic thinking known as populists? It turns out that this backlash is not against globalization at all. It's against the governments that have failed to manage it for the benefit of their societies. American and British citizens have experienced little median income growth since the financial crisis. But what benefits they have enjoyed have been because of low-cost technology imports and low interest rates due to foreigners owning 40% of American treasuries. Examples of, yes, globalization. So don't blame globalization if you fail to invest in trade adjustment assistance or STEM education. Blame yourself. Now ask yourself what happens if talent flows to other countries' tech sectors, if foreigners dump your treasuries and the dollar loses its role as the anchor of global finance. You're just asking for a repeat of the Suez Crisis. And that didn't exactly make Britain great again, did it? Nor will Brexit, which is only going to be fixed through apparently 150 new trade agreements. Again, globalization is the solution to the problems that apparently are caused by globalization. What's happening is that populists just want to replace the excesses of laissez-faire policy with the guaranteed failure of so-called economic nationalism. Let's ask the soybean farmers if they want to scale back globalization. Let's ask the workers at the BMW plant in South Carolina what they'll feel once German car makers decide to relocate production to a country whose leaders better appreciate globalization. Here's a popular trope. Let's nearshore Apple iPhone production to the US. Then let's come back in 1 year and see how Apple's global revenues fare. If you deglobalize America or any other country, you're just hurting yourself. So globalization is not the cause of this backlash, but it does expose which governments are doing the best or the worst job of adapting their societies to the global economy. The best thing about a truly globalized world, though, is that it is ever less dependent on any one source of growth or beholden to a single point of failure. Instead, countries and companies can navigate around choke points. If you're against TPP, it's going into effect next month anyway. You can oppose the BRI, the greatest new wave of globalization, but 80 countries have joined it anyway. So you don't win globalization by retreating from it. You have to go where the growth is.
Time's up.
Last punchline. Because that punchline, I hope Stephen King agrees with it, I pulled it off the HSBC website.
Thank you, Parag. No, you got it. Well, okay. I have a feeling he's supposed to stay up here and stand by the podium, but maybe we'll get both of them to stand afterwards. Okay, so now, in support of the motion, has globalization gone too far? Yes, it has. Stephen King, Senior Economic Advisor at HSBC and author of several books which basically argue globalization has gone too far. Stephen.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. When you hear that the First World War and the plague were just blips, you know that the argument has been lost, because obviously globalization can go in reverse in really quite significant ways. You look at the history of globalization from the ancient Roman Empire through to the domination of Islam between 500 and 1000 AD, through to the British Empire. In each case, you have a variant of globalization, but in each case, it goes into reverse. It is also worth stressing that from a technology point of view, technology alone does not guarantee a continuous process towards globalization. In research of my book that came out last year, Grave New World, I was reading through Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which many of you will know is set in Davos, but set in Davos in 1913. He talks about the optimism at the time about the technological advances, the way they bring together the universal brotherhood of nations, a sense that nations come together happily because technology connects them. And of course, he was having a laugh at these techno-optimists because the First World War came through just shortly thereafter. I'd like to suggest that over the course of the last few years, the West's love affair with globalization has significantly come to an end. I should stress also that I'm a fan of globalization, but I recognize that the politics is changing quite rapidly. Why is it changing? Because for many, many decades, the West had a rules-based international system coming through from the end of the Second World War with the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. That rules-based system seemed to work, and indeed in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous paper, The End of History, it seemed as though Western values would not just stay in the West, they might be universal truths that spread to other parts of the world. We discovered subsequently that that story really hasn't worked very well for the West at all. First of all, because of significantly weaker economic growth than was expected, which has put tremendous pressure on fiscal authorities and tremendous pressure on politicians to have to break promises that they had previously made. You've seen a huge increase in wealth and income inequality. And at the same time, authoritarian regimes, like China most obviously, have seen tremendous economic success. Back in 1980, Chinese living standards were the equivalent of those in the US in around about the 1790s. By 2010, they'd risen to the equivalent of the US in around about the 1930s. That success from a non-democratic model has caused, I think, a tremendous sense of fear within the Western world. So what's now beginning to happen? We're seeing a rejection of globalization. I agree with Parag, in fact, that globalization is not the only reason why the West is in difficulty. Failures to invest in education, failures to understand the full effects of technology, failures with regard to geographical and social mobility, they all have an influence on the poor performance of the West over the course of the last few years. But fixing those things is difficult. And the consequence is the West has opted to go for increasingly populist politicians who are increasingly isolationist. They blame the rest of the world for their own difficulties. And as a consequence of that, the West is withdrawing from that rules-based international order. Take, for example, the US walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or take the UK walking away from the EU, or take some of the Eastern European countries coming up with an increasingly anti-immigration kind of policy. Now, of course, if the US walks away, if the West walks away, you create a vacuum. And in that vacuum, there's no doubt that China will want to fill some of it with things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Those institutions are being created here and now. But what they point to is a very different kind of world to the one we've been living through over the course of the last few decades. Not a world associated with universal values, not a world associated with Western dominance, but a world of competing power games, a world of competing centers of power. In George Orwell's 1984, he talks about Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. I'll just replace those names with the US, Russia, and China, and you have something perhaps approximating some of the uncertainties that came through in his particular novel. And it also raises a very important question for Europe. Does it look westwards to its former friend across the Atlantic, a democracy, but a democracy that's no longer supporting global international institutions? Or does it increasingly look east towards the opportunities economically created in Asia, which doesn't have the same democratic values that Europe itself has had over many, many years? I think in these circumstances, we have to reflect on a very different model beginning to emerge. Yes, lots of countries are in favor of one version of globalization, but they simply cannot agree on what it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so now we have our third speaker who will be speaking again against the motion, so saying globalization has not gone too far. Nandan Nilekani, chairman and co-founder of Infosys. Nandan.
Mr. King reflected his confusion when he cited the greatest development in the history of humanity, which is the rise of people from poverty into better living standards in China, as an example of globalization gone too far. I think what we have seen in the last 30 to 40 years is the greatest improvement in living standards across the world, which is why today, in countries and regions with populations of over 1 billion people, all have voted totally for globalization. China has shown what they can do with globalization. India has improved living standards for 1 billion people over the last several years. And even as Brexit and the British are leaving the European Union, the biggest unheralded change happening in the world is the fact that 55 countries in Africa have come together to sign a continental free trade agreement to make sure that the 1.3 billion in Africa, the multi-trillion-dollar economy, has free exchange of goods, services, and people. So I think this concern about globalization is really a very narrow concern, and moreover, it is a concern which is the wrong concern. Because as my colleague Parag mentioned, if there is a populist backlash in UK and the US, and because people's living standards have not improved, it's not just because of globalization. In fact, globalization is a very minor factor in that. The reason it is so is because, number one, we live in an era of automation. And many more jobs are lost to automation than to globalization. But it's far easier to blame somebody in China, India, or Mexico for taking away your job than to blame a machine. So it's just more politically easier to do that. Moreover, We are living in an era of rapid change of technology, which is going to happen whether we globalize or not. And therefore, it means that our people, whether they're in rich countries or poor countries, will need to have the ability to continuously learn and retrain themselves. So we are going away from an era where we went to school, went to college, got a degree, and got a job, to an era where we are going to doing lifelong learning, which means a fundamental re-architecting and reimagining how we deliver education in all our societies. And it is a failure of the system to reform that, which is also responsible for the situation where people are left with obsolete skills, are not able to cope with the changes in the society. So I think it's a reform of the education system that is required. Moreover, another big issue in many of these countries is the increasing rise in healthcare costs. We are seeing healthcare costs in the US rising to almost 20% of GDP. And again, that is also a big reason for the backlash, because people are finding that the incomes are not going up, but the healthcare costs are going up. That again is a failure of domestic reform. Why do you blame globalization for the fact that you have not reformed your healthcare system? And finally, there's the whole cost of real estate. Today, they say that to start a company in Silicon Valley in a garage, you need to spend millions of dollars buying the garage. Because there's so little real estate available, because they have all their complex systems, not in my backyard, these rules, those rules, you can't build a house. So fundamentally, why should we blame globalization for the impact of automation, for the impact of high education cost, for the impact of high healthcare cost, and the impact of high real estate cost? Let's not blame. It's very convenient to blame some poor guy in some country. Moreover, globalization is going through a sea change. The first globalization came out of goods. Containerization led to globalization. The second globalization is coming out of services, because packetization, the fact that data flows in packets, is leading to services. And today, 40% of the world is services, that is leading to a global technology, leveling the playing field. We have 2.5 billion people today who have access to phones. On their phone, they get access to the world's knowledge. They get access to automatic translation. So I think this is very important. And finally, globalization is also about climate change, about pandemics, and about migration. A hurricane does not distinguish between Haiti and the Hilton in Miami. It's the same thing for the hurricane. A virus can go anywhere in the world and kill millions of people. And a migrant can come from Syria into Turkey, or a migrant can run away from the gangs of San Salvador to come to the US. He doesn't care about border control and some wall somebody is building. So fundamentally, if you're going to deal with the new challenges of climate change, of migration and refugees, and of the whole issue of viruses, we need more globalization, not less. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I think Nandan has a potential career in broadcasting, because that was timed to the second, I can tell you. And so, well, okay, Stephen, all right. Maybe I wasn't taking I'm glad that you're all priding yourself on your timekeeping. When did that ever happen? This is a really different kind of conference. Okay, so we have our final speaker, again, proposing the motion, globalization has gone too far, Diana Choyleva, Chief Economist and founder of Enodo Economics.
So, let me start by saying to all of you that actually, personally, globalization for me has been a great thing. I was born in Bulgaria when it was communist, and during my school years, the teachers did their best to teach me not to think. The Berlin Wall fell, and my life changed dramatically for the better. I went to study and work in the UK, and I learned from some of the best minds in economics, people who definitely made me think. And for the past 20 years, I've been living abroad in either Europe or Asia, so I really consider myself as a global citizen. But it is also clear to me that globalization, as we have had it, has gone too far. Now imagine a Martian. He'll be sitting there looking at Earth, thinking, why are they quarreling? As far as he would see, the global economy have never had it so good as it had in the past 30 years. As Nandan said, vast parts of the population were pulled out of poverty. But back on Earth, we are all looking at that development through the lenses of our own nationality. And from that standpoint, big parts of those who benefited were actually in developing countries. And vast parts of the electorate in developed nations felt left behind. So, from that perspective, if we believe that the nation state matters to most Earth people, I would argue to you that globalization, as we have had it, has gone too far. Now let me move on to an economic argument. Over the last 20 years, one of the major developments that shaped globalization as we have had it is the amalgamation of two distinctly different economic systems. That of China, which is a semi-command economy, and the market economies of the West, in particular America through the yuan-dollar peg. And that relationship has been far from symbiotic. This clash between two very different systems have not worked out. The result, the global financial crisis and 10 years of weak growth. Now let me talk a little bit about that, because there is a general sense that the financial crisis was caused by American profligacy and the failure of capitalism per se. But actually, it was caused by China consuming too little. To put it more directly, they were saving excessively, and they were willing to throw those money at the US at next to no cost. So there was very little American policymakers could have done to prevent the catastrophic buildup of domestic debt, even if they had wanted to. There is one simple way that I have found to prove this thesis to you, and it's to use the national accounting identity in economics that saving equals investment. If it was American profligacy that was the driver, to induce the extra saving to match the investment, we needed to see high real interest rates. If it was China's ex-ante desire to save excessively out of income, to induce the investment, we needed to see low real interest rates. And you all know what happened to inflation-adjusted rates globally. So now, China has stated very clearly it wants to pursue its own model. And the US, or the West for that matter, doesn't seem intent on converging and becoming a command economy. So, unless we can fuse those models together, globalization from an economic standpoint has gone too far. We need to redraw the rules of engagement in order to make globalization work for most. We need to look at trade and capital flows and make sure that the system can service two different parts of the world wanting to forge their own way. We need to make trade work for everyone, not at the expense of democracy, not at the expense of the nation state, and not in the expense of world peace.
Go over there.
Stephanie.
Well, I was going to congratulate and thank everyone for taking the time difference so seriously, but of course we had that minor infringement which I'll have to hold against this side later on. You know what was fascinating about this is there's really not much disagreement on the basic facts from these two sides, because they are actually kind of rigorous, sensible people, but very different interpretations of those facts and the potential implications for the future. I thought it was particularly interesting that this side had a kind of Marxist technological determinism in its view, that this was an unstoppable process, in part because of technology and the gains of globalization. And there was a pretty strong view on this side that it was not unstoppable. Whether or not you want to stop it, there was certainly a sense that it could easily fragment. So I think maybe on this side, maybe Parag, because you were the first person to say it so clearly, just the argument Stephen made, pointing to these long periods in history, and I wouldn't get him going on history because he knows his history, hundreds of years where the world went backwards in terms of integration. How can you be so confident that this really is an ongoing process?
Well,
unstoppable process.
The further back you go in history, in order to play the movie of history forward to the present, the more you see that you can have minor slowdowns, again, like the plague, like financial crises, World War I, and so forth, or the retraction of certain empires. But you have larger cycles that move globalization forward, and those relate much more to the integration of the world economy, to infrastructure, and to the growth of global trade.
Just as a point of information, if we had 50 years now where we were going in the wrong way, would you still think and then we started globalizing again, would you still think you were right?
I could only answer that if we actually began to go the wrong way, which we haven't, right? We actually haven't. There's very specific a very limited set of measures where you can say that since the financial crisis, globalization has somehow structurally reversed, right? So I cited, for example, interbank lending within Europe. And plenty of people like to pick that up and say, oh my goodness, it's the collapse of globalization. As if there are no new entrants into global capital markets. As if, again, what I mentioned with emerging market debt entering the global liquidity pool and so forth. The fact is that we have still an expansion of the world economy in terms of the total asset stock in the world. We have a significant growth or rebound in cross-border foreign investment, led all along actually by Japan, by China now as well, by Germany, many countries that are getting involved in globalization. So the notion that the financial crisis itself somehow marked the beginning of a massive turnaround in globalization is A, false, and B, it rests on an incredibly narrow set of data. It doesn't take into account migration, data flows, the rise of the services economy. It's as if you're measuring just one thing. I would liken it to the drunk man looking for his keys under the lamppost, right? He's looking to where the light is. We're just shining your light here, but the whole world economy is something much, much bigger.
Okay, so I guess throw that back at you, Stephen. If you were drawing the comparison which many people draw of the interwar period and say we all thought we were going swimmingly and then actually it could all fall apart, if you look at the world today, if you look at the technology that is forcing us all to, whether we like it or not, to be in a global community, whether it's social media, whether it's any other form of connectivity you want to pick, surely that does suggest that at some level we will continue to be a global economy, that some form of globalization has to continue to speed up.
Well, this microphone's working rather loudly. There was a view from what I describe as cyber utopians a few years back that the internet would reveal universal truths. And having done so, we would move rapidly towards a kind of democratization of the whole world, a kind of extension of the idea that US values would become increasingly universal values. What is striking about the technology of the internet, and in particular social media, is the way in which it's led away from truth towards a series of concentrated beliefs which are often biased, often wrong, and display significant herd-like behavior on behalf of human beings, which is reflected in the new politics that's begun to emerge. There's no doubt that, as I said before, I'm a fan of globalization, but I think that in terms of the new politics that's emerging, we no longer have left versus right politics, particularly in the Western world. We have politics of globalization versus isolationism. And that isolationism is partly a reflection, I think, of views and attitudes that are adopted in social media, where people simply follow others who share their beliefs rather than having those beliefs challenged. There was an interesting experiment that one of the US newspapers did before the presidential election.
Briefly.
They gave a couple of Facebook pages, one for a Democrat supporter, one for a Republican supporter, and they fed them with news based on the clicks that those two fictitious people made. What they discovered was that the news they both got was fundamentally different, completely different, because although they were unaware that their news was being sort of curated through some kind of infernal algorithm, they discovered, of course, when you went through this news, that the stories were fundamentally different. And that means it's very difficult to have universal values.
The reason I need to be fair about who gets the right side. Well, since we talked about infernal algorithms, Nandan, you're a perfectly good person to ask about that. I mean, the kind of process that Stephen's talking about, it reminds me there's a lot of conversation now about social media and the impact it's had on the world, that maybe the lesson is we're not designed to be a global species, was once something that someone said. That actually once we become able to talk to everybody, our differences actually become exacerbated, not reduced. When you look at the world, doesn't it look like it could fragment? We continue to be a global economy in some sense, but we don't have globalization because we actually fragment into warring factions.
No, on the contrary, I think, there are many challenges with social media, but they're nothing to do with globalization. They've got to do with the fact that three things have come together: the exemption on any liability on social media platforms through the Communication Decency Act, through the rise of 2.5 billion mobile users, and because of all the various other things that are happening, and the profit model from data. So I think it's a very different, we should not give the wrong diagnosis for the problem. But the fact of the matter is that we are now seeing global interchange on multiple dimensions. Historically, we thought of trade and goods as the base of globalization, and the containerization drove that. Then the packets, the internet protocol drove the data globalization. Then migration, either because of refugee migration or because of aging, where Western societies need younger workers for empathy and caring, drove migration. And then there's, of course, capital flowing around the world. So the fact that the new type of globalization is multidimensional makes it that much more complicated to either stop or reverse. And moreover, we live in a zero latency world, which means that if the president does a tweet at 3 a.m. in the morning from his bedroom, there's a tremor in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. So that is really what is happening in globalization, the zero latency world. And therefore, this cannot be reversed, this cannot be stopped. All you can say is, how do we put a wrapper around this and make it better for all of us?
Okay, well, that takes us straight to what I thought was the strongest argument on this side, which is that the backlash we're seeing is not about globalization, but against governments and governments' failure to deal with the consequences. Diana, you touched on that, but isn't that the flaw with this, that you're really blaming globalization rather than political failures? If you 1 minute.
I'm not blaming globalization because I do think globalization is a good thing. The motion as you have it, I took it to mean that we haven't built the best version of globalization to the benefit of all. Or to the benefit of most.
Debating the question.
Because, well, no, has globalization gone too far? Have we had too deep globalization? Do we need globalization light? And that would be better. And I have to say, when I woke up in the UK to the news of Brexit, I cried. But at that same time, I understood that you have to pay attention to the legitimate feelings of being left behind and displaced, of those who voted for it, of those who voted for Trump, and of those who in Europe have expressed similar views. So that made me think, what is going wrong? Of course, you can say that the governments in the developed world didn't do enough to counter the cost of globalization. But the point I wanted to make, which I think is not understood, and that dynamic is critical in us getting the future right, is that this is the first time ever that on a global stage we had the amalgamation of a command economy with a market economy. And the way we fuse them, setting the system of trade but also of capital flows along the lines of the liberal free markets, has actually not worked.
Okay, I want to throw that back a little bit on this side, because I think the argument, the sort of counter to what you've said about globalization being unstoppable is, there could be a political dynamic that is happening, even if it is really more about political failures than it is about globalization. The risk is that the gains to emerging market economies that you both highlight are going to be endangered if governments fail, and maybe we have to have a sort of imperfect globalization, a slightly more nationalistic approach in order to protect what we already have, rather than continuing to push. I don't know, Parag, is it better to sort of to go more slowly now for the sake of saving what we already have?
Globalization goes at the speed that it goes at. And my problem with their contention is that it's so top-down. It's portraying the world as actually being consciously divided into these rival camps that have defined antithetical ideologies and so forth. But in fact, it's happening, again, incrementally because so many countries see a stake in it. So, for example, you posit that the West somehow is backing away and retreating from globalization. Canada is not part of the West. It just ratified the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Chile just joined the Belt and Road Road Initiative, even though it's across the Pacific Ocean from China. Europe, every European country has joined the Belt and Road Initiative to create a larger trade and commercial zone encompassing 6 billion people. So who is this mythically unified West that is turning against globalization? Germany certainly doesn't like to hear from the Trump administration that it needs to rein in its surpluses because it's exporting them to Asia. In fact, Europe trades way more with Asia, about $500 billion a year more, than it even does with the United States. So it's fully embracing global trade investment.
Stephen, do you want to answer that directly? That it isn't going backwards, it is actually continuing?
Yes, I find this a slightly odd assertion because you just got to look at the way in which politics is changing across the Western world to recognize that voters themselves are expressing a view that seems to be the antithesis of what both of you have expressed today. I mean, again, I agree with you that globalization has significant advantages, but I'm also aware that voters are throwing out governments that have supported it.
Voters in certain countries, but
well,
not these countries signing up to the trade.
But quite a large number. You've got the US, you've got the UK, you've got Italy, you've got Hungary, Poland, Austria. You've got Macron finding it very difficult to get reforms through in France. You've got Merkel, who's suddenly been rather undermined in Germany. I mean, you can just carry on with a list of countries that appear to be opposed to it. The other thing I just mentioned, you talk about a multi-layered version of globalization, which is different from the past. I don't think that's true. You go back to the 19th century, and you think about how globalization worked back then. It was about trade in goods, trade in services, and importantly, movement of people, big time, particularly from the old world to the new world. In a scale that we have only seen very, very recently. So it seems to me that there are lots of lessons from the past. To suggest that the situation now is completely different from the past, I think is an error. And we know from the past that things can go wrong. There was a great book written just before the First World War called, I think it was called The Grand Illusion or The Great Illusion. And it basically said, war will be futile, absolutely irrational, really stupid. And people said, that means there's a prediction that war won't happen. Well, it did happen. Because people can do dumb things in the light of political pressures that move you away from that supposedly positive story of globalization.
Okay.
I think what they're saying...
Very quick, you've got 30 seconds follow-up.
I think what they're saying is globalization is a good thing. It just needs a few tweaks. That's all they're saying.
So there's tweaks and blips. We got the World War I was a blip. And everything we're going through, guys, it just needs a bit of a tweak. That's fine. Okay, well, you might sort of take points away from this side for a little bit of complacency, but you can't fault them for their historical long-term view. They're really sort of stepping back. Okay, so right at the beginning, I think we had 1 or 2 hands who agreed that globalization has gone too far. And I sort of left it that the rest of the room was thought globalization had not gone far enough. But now, show of hands, does anyone now believe, do any more people believe that globalization has gone too far?
Same hands.
All right. I don't know if it's the same hands. I don't think anyone at all has been persuaded, but I'm sure we've been entertained and potentially educated. Thank you very much to the speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you.